Hey, Cross Park. It has been quite a while since I've done a sermon deep dive, and we're taking large chunks of the book of John here in this section, and there's so much good stuff. I thought I would do a bit of a sermon deep dive today, catching some of where we've been in recent weeks and some of where we're going in the weeks to come. So we just finished 12 and 13 these last 3 weeks, and something stood out to me in 13 that I didn't get to mention in my sermon Sunday. The foot washing incident really is a great example of what we have going on in Philippians 2. Let me read for you this famous passage from Philippians 2 about Jesus. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Now, when we hear this idea of him emptying himself, I think we're naturally confused by this. We think primarily of him getting rid of something, pouring something out and letting it go away. And the concept is, and sometimes in church history, theologians have wrestled over what this means, the idea that he's pouring out his divinity, that the better thing is it's addition by subtraction, meaning as he gets rid of his divinity to become human, now he's this new better thing, so to speak. I don't think that's what the text is saying, and I don't think it's the best way to think about it. He is pouring himself out, but think about him pouring himself, so to speak, from one container to another. He's taking his full true divinity and pouring it into full true humanity. The emphasis on in the text is on him becoming truly human. So various heresies throughout the history of the church have thought about the two natures of Jesus, and they've struggled to hold that Jesus was fully divine and fully human. And so what Paul is doing in Philippians 2 is he's trying to help you see he's fully divine and he's fully human. He's truly human. He wasn't glowing, didn't have a halo. People, as they encountered him in his earthly life, experienced him as a full, true human. He was a man. And he had poured himself, his divine nature, into this human nature. He's one person, Jesus Christ, with two natures, fully divine and fully human. So it's really subtraction by addition, meaning as he takes his divinity and adds it to humanity, now there's a sense in which he is humble, he is low, he is a servant. By adding humanity to his experience, he seems so low. And that's what we see in the foot washing scene. Right? He took on the form of a servant. He acted like the lowliest member of their culture, someone who'd wash your dirty, stinky feet. And Peter would have none of it, right? Don't wash my feet. You can't wash my feet. You're not my servant. You're not my slave. And yet that's what Jesus did, because this is an example. It's maybe the example par excellence before his death of him pouring himself out, of pouring his full divinity into full humanity so that he's truly and fully human. And this sense of him humbling himself, of taking on the form of a servant, right? It's the arc of his whole life. It's being born lowly in a stable. It's living with all the limits and difficulties of being a person in a fallen world. And ultimately, right, we said foot washing is about his death. He is on the trajectory towards his own humiliating death. And his humiliation comes before and results in his exaltation and our good. So as you think about this foot washing scene we talked about Sunday, it's really helpful to go back and look at Philippians 2 to think about as well. Another thing I said Sunday that I wanted to spend a little time on, our third point of the sermon, was that Peter shows us a kind of delayed following. And in some sense, that language is maybe not my favorite, meaning it sounds like we're just supposed to sit around and then eventually follow Jesus. You could take it that way. Hopefully you didn't hear it that way if you listened to the sermon. The idea, though, is that fundamentally, Jesus' work is the basis for any work we do. Jesus' identity is the basis for our new identity. And so the idea of a delayed following is that we have to look clearly at Jesus, at who he is and what he's done, and we have to start there. And if we understand who he is and what he's up to, then we can follow properly. There's all sorts of following that is self-focused, it's self-promoting, It's an attempt at being good enough to be good for God. That is not the gospel. That is not what he's calling us to. But this sense of delayed following is this idea that fundamentally we start from a place of rest. We rest in what Jesus did first, and then we work. Two examples of this that might be helpful to you. Eugene Peterson, in a book I read years ago, talked about how in the days of whaling, like Moby Dick and so forth, in the American whaling experience, the harpooner, when they would go out, everyone else would be rowing, trying to get close to the whale, fighting the waves. And the person with the harpoon, his job was to sit as still as possible. That, in fact, like being tense and standing up and constantly looking and waiting for the whale was not his job. That his best work was done if he was starting from a place of complete rest. And then from that place, the harpooner would know when it was time to rise and throw the harpoon. Peterson uses this as an example of the gospel, like we were just saying, that fundamentally we must rest. Faith is resting. And yes, of course, there's also work. Our faith works itself out in all sorts of ways, and it must. But it has to be first a place of rest. So that's why I call it a delayed following, is that first we rest and we look at what Jesus has done for us, and then we work. The other example of this is the shape of our week. So the early church moved the primary day of rest and worship from Saturday to Sunday. So they preserved the Sabbath principle, but moved it because of the resurrection and called it the Lord's Day rather than just Sabbath. So what's fascinating about this is in the Jewish calendar, Saturday was the end of the week, right? It was the final day, the seventh day, and Sunday was the first day of the new week. And so now we rest on the first day, meaning, if you want to think about it this way, the first thing we do each week is rest and worship. Fundamentally, we look at what God has done and who he is. We consider the cross. And then everything we do the rest of the week is a response to what he has done. Of course, with the cycles of rest and work, it's also true that we're resting after we're working. That is true. But conceptually, it's helpful to think about, if nothing else from a didactic application way of thinking, that we always rest first because it's the first day of the week. We rest first because of what Jesus has done. There is that sense of resting, delaying ever so slightly, and then properly following. The final thing I wanted to bring up was this long-term gospel story arc that you see from the very beginning of the Bible, famously Genesis 3:15, when God says to the woman and the serpent, there's going to be enmity, conflict, and strife between your offspring, and that there's some offspring coming from the woman who will constantly do battle with the offspring from the serpent, and that ultimately the offspring of the woman will defeat the offspring of the serpent, that you will bruise his head and he will bruise your heel, right? Genesis 3:15, if you haven't read that before, go check it out. And we all know that the best way to kill a snake is to stomp on its head, and yet you might get mortally wounded in the process. And all of that comes to pass in Jesus. Now, what I did not say 2 weeks ago in the sermon from chapter 12 is that Jesus himself picks up on this seed metaphor. I can't promise you that Jesus was thinking about Genesis 3:15 when he said it. Who knows? Maybe he wasn't. But it sure makes sense because the Bible tends to rhyme with itself. These themes come up and build on each other. And so here Jesus is talking about himself as the seed who must die, and go into the ground and then produce much fruit. So Jesus goes to war with the devil, with sin and evil, and it seems that he's mortally wounded, right? He dies on the cross. So in one sense, it seems that he has lost and the devil has won, and yet the true story, right, flips it from tragedy to comedy, where rather than the bad guy winning and the good guy losing, it's flipped. So on Good Friday, it seems that Satan has won. On Easter Sunday, it's clear that Jesus has triumphed. Well, all of that, Jesus being the seed who dies, who comes to life and brings more seed, the seed of the woman who wins the war, I mean, that's all from Genesis 3. All throughout the Old Testament, there's this subtle question, who's going to be the seed? Is it Abraham? Is it Isaac? Is it Moses? Is it David? And in some sense, those key characters partially fill the role, but never fully. And so we need someone to come along and fill the role, and that's Jesus. And so it's a beautiful thing to think about as we're going to be in 18 and 19 these next 2 weeks, as we're focused on the trial, all the injustice, the death of Jesus, how John loves to emphasize, and you'll see this pretty clearly, John loves to emphasize the sovereignty of Jesus, the knowledge of Jesus, the control of Jesus. So, for example, in the Synoptic Gospels, which means Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they're written from the same view, so S-Y-N, synonym, synergy, right? It means together or the same. Optic obviously means to see or to look. So these three Gospels clearly have some interrelationship. They share a lot more passages than they do with John. So they're looking from the same perspective, somewhat same, whereas John is coming from a different perspective. John does not give us Jesus wrestle and struggle in the Garden of Gethsemane in the same way that the Synoptic writers do. Now we see that same struggle. We see it in John 11. I mentioned it to you, this mad, sad, angry word where Jesus is deeply troubled. We saw it again in chapter 13 at the supper. Jesus is wrestling with what this will mean and what it will take and how fallen the world is and what's required of him to enter in his own death to deal with our death and sin. But John, it's a matter of emphasis, right? All four Gospels are going to show us both that Jesus struggles with the sense of his bearing the weight of sin on himself is difficult, and that he's willing to do it, and that he ultimately trusts the Father along the way. John just likes to emphasize that confidence and trust piece a little bit more than the other gospel writers. And so you're going to see that as we go through 18 and 19, that John presents Jesus as really in control. He knows what's coming. And he's going to enter into willingly this death that's coming to him because he's the good seed. He's the promised seed. He's the one who's going to go to war and win the battle. He's going to take sin and death and suffering on himself in order to take it off of his people. And that is, by definition, the good news of the gospel. So come join us these next couple Sundays. Again, this Sunday we'll be in chapter 18. The following Sunday we'll do most of 19. On Good Friday we'll hit the very end of 19, the burial of Jesus. And then on Easter morning, of course, we will talk about the resurrection in the first half of John 20. So hopefully you'll see some of these themes. You'll continue to see that God is at work through and in Jesus to bring about the redemption that he's always promised, and that Jesus will accomplish it in the text as we watch him die and be raised again. Well, I hope this deep dive was helpful to you. Maybe it'll help orient your mind and heart a little bit for the next couple weeks as we head towards Easter. Thanks, Cross Park. See you on Sunday morning, 9:30 Sunday school, 10:30 worship service.